Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 17th of July of 2024. Today we have lots of very interesting updates, so let's start. And the most important update to my mind is coming from the fields and the tree lines between the towns of Latka, Volodymyrovka, Mykolaiv, Vuhledar and Vuhledar. We're talking about these fields, these tree lines and these fortifications. According to information we have, according to video that was published by the Ukrainian sources, the Russians, as a result of unexpected light fastening attack, managed to establish complete control over these tree lines to break the Ukrainian defense belt and to land infantry right in front of T0524 road. So this is the road of Russian attack. They were moving very fast, just one personnel carrier with stormtroopers. The Russians landed in this point, and after that the Russians captured this tree line. Few seconds later, the Russian personnel carrier most likely was destroyed as a result of FPV drone strike. Obviously, this is significant progress of the armed forces of Russian Federation. The Russians managed to establish physical control over T0524 road. The Ukrainians, who are, let's say, connected to the situation, who has their own insights, stated that this attack took place a few days ago. This attack took place on the 13th of July. This is very important update, and now this attack, this progress of the armed forces of Russian Federation explains a lot. First of all, this attack explains the visit, urgent, let's say unexpected visit of Valery Gerasimov, chief of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Russian Federation, in Mariupol, where he visited the command headquarters and the command center of the Group of Forces East. Currently, we don't know for sure what exactly they were talking about, but now, due to the new things that we have discovered during the previous 24 hours, most likely Gerasimov was talking with the head of this direction about further plans. Obviously, Gerasimov has the plans of every single direction, but probably he was talking with the commander of this direction face to face, trying to understand whether this direction needs additional help, additional reinforcements, or they can handle with everything with their own forces. And as I understand, due to this visit, due to this progress, most likely the Russians are not going to stop. They will try to improve their positions in this direction. And first, there are two most obvious steps from the Russian side. The first one, most likely the Russians will try to improve their positions and to capture another stronghold that lays between Sotnytskyi and Vuhledar itself. We're talking about this rich network of the fortifications. This is as must Russian, let's say, goal, objective, because if the Russians are able to establish complete control over this network of the fortifications, first of all, the Russians will improve their positions, they will increase their foothold, and they will reduce chances of armed forces of Ukraine to conduct successful counterattack with the purpose to force the Russians to fall back. Also, as the next target, as the next step, we can make a conclusion that most likely the Russians will try to attack this small artillery pocket. Maybe, and there are very high chances that Ukrainians have already abandoned these positions due to critical situation between Sotnytskyi and Vuhledar itself, but for now we don't have geolocations that can confirm this, so that's why we can make a conclusion that most likely this is the next or the third Russian target in this direction for the next few weeks. And as soon as the Russians are able to capture these fields, which most likely is going to happen very soon, then the Russians will be able to focus on the next strongholds, and there are 4 strongholds next to these positions. And the most powerful stronghold, of course, Vuhledar itself. But the problem for the Ukrainians, of course, that if the Russians are able to move further in direction of Vuhledar and the coal mines to the west of Vuhledar, most likely the Ukrainians will be forced to fall back from Vuhledar itself. They will wait when the Russians will get to the outskirts of Vuhledar from some of the direction. Of course, only after that they will abandon their positions, but anyway, the days of the stronghold would be numbered. The next stronghold next to possible Russian foothold is the coal mine that lays on the road 0524. This is very important and powerful position with the Terikon landfill behind, with the high-rise building areas and with significant number of underground facilities. Of course, the village Vuhledar itself is the third stronghold in this area, which probably is the weakest stronghold in this direction, because this is just a low-rise building area with significant number of barracks and farms and just regular buildings. And the last stronghold is the coal mine next to the main village Vodyane, which is also very powerful and stronghold position, strong position with high-rise building area and very rich network of the underground facilities. Anyway, the battle for the South Donetsk has begun. During the previous days we got significant updates about Russian progress on the line Urozhaina, Staromayorsk, Velika, Novoselovka. Today the Russians continue bombing and attacking the Ukrainian forces with artillery, with aviation, with different types of weapon. Now the Russians mainly are focused on the next strongholds and the next defense belt. As you can see in this video, the Russians are bombing these positions with aviation cluster bomb RBK 500, so most likely they will renew their attempts to move further in the northern direction. And of course Kostyantynivka, Novomikhailivka itself, another points of pressure from the Russian side. There are very heavy clashes. Only thing we can state that this area is under responsibilities of 79th Brigade that lost lots of soldiers during the previous phases of offensive operation in this direction, and they have almost lost their combat capabilities. But according to them, according to their official statements, the Ukrainians managed to collect and bring additional reinforcement, so this brigade managed to restore their combat capabilities and they will show additional resistance in the future. Anyway, this is very important progress, any very important update, so let's see, let's follow, and let's wait what is going to be next. Now let's move further and let's talk about Krasnogorovka. As we discussed in the previous update, the Russians managed to improve their positions from the central part of the city to the northern part, forcing the Ukrainians to fall back further and further in the northwestern direction. According to different mappers, the Russians managed to improve their positions along Ostrovskого Street and Belinskого Street as well, also forcing the Ukrainians to fall back. We see significant number of videos that were published from this direction of how the Russians were bombing and attacking the Ukrainian positions with artillery. So this is something like non-stop artillery strikes, forcing the Ukrainians to move further and further with the purpose to clear this territory completely. According to information we have, the Ukrainian 59th Brigade that is responsible for defense of this area have already lost its combat capabilities a long time ago. The Ukrainians also trying to stabilize the situation brought additional reinforcements and reserves to this direction, and as for concerning this 59th Brigade, they were reinforced with Colombians, with the volunteers from Colombia. And maybe you've seen during the previous days there were lots of updates about significant casualties, losses between soldiers of these Colombian soldiers due to artillery strikes and so on. And just today one of Colombian soldiers published the video about very bad and very difficult situation in Krasnogorovka. He stated that his squad was abandoned by the Ukrainians in this area. They were encircled, and his real target, his real purpose of that message wasn't like to blame somebody. He, according to his voice, according to his statements, it was already known that he was captured and probably already done. The only thing he was doing is asking and begging other waves of Colombians or other waves of foreign volunteers not to go to Ukraine, because it's useless waste, not even of time, but useless waste of lives. The Russians, according to him, are too strong for NATO and for Ukrainians. Now let's move further and let's talk about western Avdiivka direction. As you can see, we have significant number of geolocations. Most of them we have already discussed in the previous videos. As we discussed during the previous update, the Russians captured the northern Novosilivka Persha part completely, according to different mappers, but yet we haven't received even a single video that can confirm this. The only video we have is the video that was published by the Ukrainian soldiers of how they were FPV droning the Russians inside of the farms that located in the northern part of the village. This is a very important video that confirms complete control over the farms, but not over the village itself. I have no doubts that the Russians captured the northern part, but we are gonna wait for additional details and updates. According to information we have, the Russians continue moving further in direction of progress. The progress is very slow, just few tens meters every day, but the most important that the Ukrainians can't stop the Russians, and despite the fact that the progress is just 10-20 meters a day, the Russians are moving closer and closer. And if we calculate the distance between the first buildings and the Russian edge position, it's just less than 600 meters, which means that probably in 1 week the Russians will begin clashes inside of the village itself. As for geolocations, we haven't received anything, just one video that was published by the Russians, how they managed to discover the Ukraine artillery position, probably D-20 or D-30 howitzer along the tree line between Progress itself and Novoselivka-Pershe, and the Russians, as a result of counter-artillery duels, managed to destroy this artillery system. Now let's move further in direction of Vuhledar. Today, lots of mappers have adjusted their maps, showing that the Russians captured this village completely. This information was confirmed by pro-Ukrainian mappers and by the pro-Russian and neutral mappers as well. We have just one video of Russian attack that was published by the Ukrainian sources. In this video, we can see 2 Russian armored vehicles that were heading towards Vuhledar, but according to this video, they were destroyed, let's say, in 1.5 kilometers, so they haven't managed to enter. Maybe because this video was published by the Ukrainians, we haven't seen how they entered the village, or maybe some other reason. Now let's move further. As for Vozdvizhenka Novoalexandrovka, the Russians stopped publishing any updates from this direction. During the previous 24 hours, we got just one video that showed us the movement of Russian soldiers between the tree lines, between forest, between some buildings. This is Russian soldier. The video was published by 110th Brigade, and this video just confirms the Russian presence in this area. Now let's move further. Let's talk about New York, or Novgorodsk, according to the old previous title of the city. The Russians and the Ukrainians have a very powerful, very heavy clashes inside of Petrovska Gora. The Ukrainians during the previous few days managed to concentrate the critical mass and to stabilize the line of combat contact. Furthermore, according to different mappers, the Ukrainians, after they brought additional forces in this direction, launched a full-scale counter-offensive operation, and the Ukrainians managed to restore control over 2 streets in this area. So, summarizing everything, according to some mappers, the Ukrainians restored control over this territory. So basically, the Ukrainians reached the first buildings of high-rise area in Petrovska Gora, but this time high-rise building area is under complete Russian control, but not under Ukraine control. So let's see how the Ukrainians are going to fight, how the Ukrainians are going to crack these strongholds, because since the beginning of the special military operation, Russians were the side that were forced since the beginning of this war to attack and to capture the strongholds, and now the Ukrainians will try their own luck. On the other hand, we continue receiving reports and updates that the Russians are trying to move further in direction of the heart of New York, and we are talking about this industrial area that lays along the main railway station in the city of New York. The Russians captured additional industrial zones, additional buildings, but for now without any geolocations that can confirm this. Now let's move to New York, Toretsk, Druzhba, Pivnichny agglomeration. We have few videos. The Russians were bombing the Toretsk stronghold in the central part with FABs, with artillery, with aviation. This is a very important process because the Russians obviously are heading in this direction. Of course, it will take time, maybe months, maybe 2, while the Russians are able to get there, but they're trying to destroy the main Ukrainian positions exactly in this stronghold before the Russians comes, but not after, because it will require maybe a month or 2 to ruin this stronghold before the Russians are able to move further in direction of Kostyantynivka. Now let's move further. Let's talk about Chasiv Yar. The pro-Russian sources reported that the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to improve their flanks positions in the vicinity of Kalinovka and to capture the farms. So these farms from now on under complete Russian control, according to some pro-Russian mappers. Yet we haven't received even a single geolocation that can confirm this, but most likely, telling the truth, I have no doubts that this is exactly that happened there, or the Russians are about to do this, because this is very important if the Russians are planning to move further in the western direction or in the northern direction. As for Chasiv Yar itself, as you can see, we haven't received almost anything from this direction, just a few regular updates of how the Russians were hunting and attacking the Ukrainian soldiers in the buildings in the western part of the city. Now let's move further. Just few words about Razdolovka. According to information we have, the Russians attacked the Ukrainians along the main street between Razdolovka and Perezhny itself, and as a result of attack, the Russians captured few more tree lines in the fortifications of the armed forces of Ukraine. And according to information we have, by the evening of the 17th of July, the Russians were controlling this part of Perezhny itself. So obviously significant progress. The Russians managed to enter the residential area, and now just a question of time when the Russians will move through these buildings until they get the southern outskirts of Zvanovka and then of Siversk itself. As for Siversk, we see the Russians are not reducing the pressure in this direction, artillery pressure. The Russians are bombing and attacking, the Russians are hunting, conducting reconnaissance operation, and then bombing the Ukrainian forces and positions along the tree lines, along the railways, between buildings, and so on. Now let's move further and let's talk about Kupin's direction. We haven't received lots of updates. The most important are coming from Stepovo-Novoselovka, Kislovka-Kotляrovka area. After a very short operational pause, the Russians resumed their attempts to move further in the western direction with the purpose to establish this rocade. This is the next defense on the stronghold of the armed forces of Ukraine. We have the videos of how the Ukrainians were resisting the Russians, FPV droning them, and we have the video of how the Russians destroyed Ukrainian FPV drone Baba Yaga above this area. So the Russians resumed their attempts to attack, and maybe during the next few days we're going to receive additional updates. We have changed the color a little bit, the color of the forest between Liman 1, Sinkovka and Kupetsk itself. In this video that was published by the Russians, we can see the process of how the Russians were bombing the Ukrainian positions, at least according to the author of this video. Based on this, we have adjusted the map and we have returned this part under complete Ukrainian control. Now let's move to Kharkiv direction. We received significant number of updates, and the most important, as we discussed in the previous video, the Russians announced the restrictions in some villages and towns along the border. We have already discussed the reason and the purposes of this action. We talked that probably there are a few reasons. First of them is that the Russians concentrated the forces between and along the towns and the cities that were restricted. And another opinion is that the Russians are trying to remove civilians from the fire of armed forces of Ukraine in this direction. And today probably we got the final answer to the question why the Russians restricted the borderlands. The thing is that today we got the final confirmation that the Russians established complete control over the village by the name of Sotnytskyi Kozachok. Very strange and very weird situation. We have video that confirms the Russian presence there. The video was published by the Ukrainian sources. In this video we can see the Russian soldiers, the Russian infantry moving from one building to another, and how the Ukrainians were FPV droning them, those soldiers who, let's say, left their strongholds or shelters. I'll remind you that months ago the Ukrainians have already stated that something weird was happening there. They colored this territory as a gray zone. Later, the Ukrainians colored this territory as an area under complete Russian control. After that, and few few days ago they colored this territory once again under complete Ukraine control, and now we received the final confirmation, the final video that shows and confirms Russian presence there. So we have adjusted the map, and once again the main topic is that the Russians restricted area for civilians in the vicinity of Sotnytskyi Kozachok. The Russians restricted access to Безыменное, Горьковское, Богодун городок, Шельтинковка и Volkovsky. So obviously this is not the only points of pressure, the only place the Russians are planning to attack. We have more artillery strikes, more artillery preparations along this territory, and obviously, and something tells me that most likely during the next few days the Russians will attack more and they will try to improve their positions, and this is, I'll remind you, as Zolochev, the Zolochev direction. That's called by the name of the main city in this area, Zolochev. And once again, I'll remind you that there is another area where the Russians restricted access. This is the territory along Sumy border, Sumy region, and this is probably the most important because very likely that the Russians do have some concentration of forces here as well, and the Russians may start to attack in this direction, in Sumy direction, also very soon. According to information we have, according to the Ministry of Defense, as a result of negotiation process, 95 Russian servicemen who were in mortal danger in captivity have been returned from the territory controlled by Kiev, by Ukraine. So there was a prisoner exchange, 95 for 95. This is very important, but the sources are saying that during the next few days there are going to be more exchange process, more prisoners will return back home from Ukraine and from Russia. As for Kiev updates, we continue talking about F-16. The Western countries, NATO countries, change their mind every single day. Today we got report that the Western countries, the United States of America, haven't authorized Ukrainians and Ukrainians that are using F-16s in the special military operation to attack the territory of old Russia. They can attack the territory that, according to the Western classification, are occupied by the Russians, but not the territory of old Russia. This is very important. So let's see, of course, what is going to be next. And that's it for this video. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for your watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.